Hi, I'm the History Guy, and if you didn't know, in addition to our YouTube channel, we also have a page on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you can support the work of the History Guy, and for that $1 a month, you're going to get all the content that you get on the YouTube channel, but advertising free, and in addition, you get one specific video a month that is made exclusively for patrons on Patreon, and occasionally, when the History Guy is traveling, we're able to bring one of those episodes to the YouTube audience. Today, we're going to talk about a helmet and find out that when you have a historical hat, sometimes you can find a detail inside that hat that tells you something about where it's been. And that's true today as we look at an iconic style of helmet, but find a detail inside that helmet that tells us that that particular helmet was part of a crucial turning point in world events. Enjoy the episode, and if you do enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. This is a British Army helmet of the Second World War of the type that is called Helmet Steel Mark II. It's based on a design that was patented by a man named John Leopold Brodie in 1915 for the First World War, and because of that, helmets like this are sometimes called Brodie helmets, although that title only properly applies to the original 1915 model. The Mark II model is really very similar to the Mark I model, which was used throughout the First World War and up until 1940. The Mark I model was the model for the United States Model 1917 helmet. The original design came as a response to the shocking number of head injuries due to shell fire in the Great War. The British realized the need for steel head protection at the same time as the French and evaluated the new French steel helmet design that had been produced by Louis Adrien. The British decided that the Adrien helmet, which had been adopted by several armies, offered insufficient protection and was too complex to manufacture, and sought a new design. Inventor John Leopold Brodie was born in Latvia, had become wealthy in South Africa, and was at the time of the invention of his helmet living in London, and he created the design. His helmet was stamped from a single piece of metal, which allowed a thicker helmet and easier manufacturing than Adrien's design. It is relatively wide-brimmed, and that helps to protect shoulders as well as the head from shrapnel coming from above, although it did not protect the lower head and neck as well as the French Adrien helmet and the German Stahlhelm. Brody was so confident in his design that during Army evaluation of the design, he allowed himself to be struck on the head with a heavy iron bar, shot at with a pistol while wearing the helmet. While the original design went through modifications to the liner, metal, and brim edge, nearly 7.5 million of Brodie's tin hats were produced during the Great War. These helmets had many nicknames. Officers often referred to it as a battle bowler, and it was also generally called a Tommy helmet. The American version was commonly called a doughboy helmet, and the Germans generally called both of them the salad bowl. But if you happen upon a World War I version of the Brodie helmet, be careful handling it, as the liner likely has asbestos in it. The design was only slightly modified for the Mark II version, used during the Second World War. One curious change was that the folded rim was changed to a non-magnetic metal so as to not interfere with the use of a compass. While the British produced an improved Mark III helmet that started being issued in 1943, as well as a different helmet for airborne troops, the steel Mark II helmet was used by British and Commonwealth troops throughout the war. Versions were produced locally in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. Australia alone produced more than 2 million Mark II helmets, South Africa another 1.5 million, and Canada 1.3 million. Canadian forces continued to use the Mark II helmet in frontline service until 1960. The design, although sometimes using mild steel, was worn by police, fire brigades, and air raid wardens throughout Britain and elsewhere in the Commonwealth. This helmet is unique, though, because its liner is not the standard liner for a Mark II helmet. Rather, this is a very distinct liner, and it reveals another chapter in this helmet's history. This helmet, used by the British during the Second World War, appears to have been refurbished and modified for use by the Greek army. The roots of the Greek Civil War came from the Second World War. When the Axis powers occupied Greece, the king, George II, was forced to flee and to create a government in exile. Resistant groups arose throughout the country to fight the German occupation, but those groups themselves had different ideologies. While some resistant groups were supporters of the king, others were derived from left-leaning, pro-communist parties. While fighting to oppose fascism, the left-leaning parties had as an underlying goal a plan to control politics in post-war Greece. There was occasional fighting between the partisan groups, and leftist groups sought to repress monarchist opposition. The Allies, especially Britain, provided supply to the resistance groups, but tried to direct the supplies to the groups that they thought were most reliable and kept an eye towards post-war politics. This had the result of creating two factions, one primarily supplied by the British. As the war wore on, the fighting was increasingly between partisan groups rather than against the Nazi occupiers. Both sides were accused of atrocities. When the Germans withdrew in 1944, the government returned and, fearing a communist takeover by the leftist resistance groups, demanded a general disarmament of the resistance, seeking to maintain only a few units loyal to the government. That, in turn, caused the resignation of the leftist ministers of the National Unity government, as well as calling for strikes and demonstrations. Police fired on the demonstrators, and the divide turned into open conflict. The British directly supported the government, bringing in troops to fight the communist forces. This was quite an embarrassment for Britain, as British troops were fighting anti-German resistance fighters while the war with Germany was still going on. Churchill tried to negotiate a peace, but was unsuccessful. In 1946, the communists, more militant following the end of the war and confident they could gain the upper hand, boycotted the national elections, thus removing the chance for a political solution. Greece fell into outright civil war, with the government forces supported by the British and the communist forces supported by Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. It was during this period that the British sent all sorts of war surplus equipment, including thousands of Mark II and Mark III helmets to be used by government troops fighting in the Greek Civil War. Stalin and the Soviets were largely ambivalent, looking to protect their interests elsewhere. As extremists from both sides had regularly engaged in acts of terrorism against the other side's supporters, the conflict was more bitter and divided. Both sides engaged in more atrocities, each asserting that they were retaliating for the acts of the other. The final end to the conflict came when Stalin pressed Yugoslavia to stop supporting the Greek communists. Stalin argued that Britain and the US would not give up Greece and feared that the Greek communist resistance would lead Britain and the US to intervene in other countries. The Civil War affected Grecian politics for decades. The refusal by the communists to participate in the 1946 elections prevented political solutions or parliamentary moderation. The attacks on civilians from both sides created a schism of hatred. The Civil War left the country in worse financial and economic shape than had been caused by the Second World War. Government forces cracked down on anyone seen as supporting the communist insurrection, and thousands were jailed or fled to exile. The government left behind was unstable, and in 1967 that resulted in a military coup and a military regime that lasted until 1974. While there was some moderation and rapprochement in the 1980s, the divisions of the Greek Civil War still persist today. But the Greek Civil War also had significant implications for the world in the post-war era. In 1947, Britain, near financial collapse due to the cost of the world wars, announced that it could no longer support the Greek government. In response, the United States took over financial support for the government troops fighting in the Civil War. The support was justified in a speech by President Truman to Congress on March 12, 1947. In the speech, Truman said, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." That was the first enunciation of what has come to be called the Truman Doctrine, a policy of containment of Soviet expansion that guided U.S. foreign policy in the post-war era. That speech is considered by many historians to mark the beginning of the Cold War and directly led to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the general East-West polarization that still plays a role in world politics today. While the Greek Civil War is seen by many to be the first of the Cold War proxy wars, in fact, the Soviets provided little support for the Greek communists. The reason for that is often tied back to a conversation between Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill in 1945 called the Percentages Agreement. During the conversation, related by Churchill, Churchill and Stalin made an informal, knotty agreement to divide Europe into spheres of influence, listing the proposed percentage of influence that each country would get in Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. While there is disagreement over how Stalin perceived the conversation and informal agreement, which he purportedly supported by drawing a tick or check mark on the paper written by Churchill, it still seems clear that Stalin followed a policy of withholding support for communists in Greece in exchange for, at least to reduce the justification for, interference by the US and Britain with Soviet influence in other nations. This eventually resulted, largely in response to the creation of NATO, in an agreement signed in May 1955 called a Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance that would be called the Warsaw Pact. In support of his plan to abandon Greece in order to preserve interests elsewhere, Stalin pressured Yugoslavian President Josip Tito to withdraw support for the Greek communists. While Tito eventually followed Stalin's wishes, the disagreement over the support of Greek communists, whom Tito had hoped would win control of Greece independently, was a large part of the split between Tito and Stalin that would be a significant role in Cold War politics. Although there would be some rapprochement following the death of Stalin in 1955, the split meant that Yugoslavia would chart an independent course, and even became a leader of the non-aligned movement, which offered a counterbalance to the Cold War US-USSR dichotomy. Like much of my collection, I wish I knew more about this particular helmet. I don't know what service it saw in the Second World War. I don't know when or how it was used in the Greek Civil War. These British helmets with Greek liners were sold as war surplus, and they're actually relatively common today, and yet this hat is still priceless to me because it represents a unique moment in world history. It represents that period when we shifted from the end of the Second World War and moved into the Cold War. This helmet represents the time that defined world politics and much of what we would call history for my generation. And it is history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.